Richard Miller adjusted the knot on his expensive silk tie, the charcoal gray fabric a stark contrast to the cheerful, sun-drenched afternoon unfolding outside Willow Creek Manor. 10 years. It had been 10 long years since the divorce that had cleaved his life in two. 10 years since Sarah, his ex-wife, had taken their daughter, Emily, and moved on, eventually remarrying a man Richard privately referred to as Mr. Beige, David Jenkins. Today, Emily, his little girl, impossibly grown up and radiant, was getting married. A wave of genuine paternal pride washed over him, quickly followed by the familiar undertow of resentment. He surveyed the venue. It was nice. Rustic chic, they probably called it. Exposed beams, fairy lights strung between trees, mason jars holding wildflowers. Quaint. Endearing even. But it wasn't the plaza, was it? It wasn't the kind of statement wedding he would have thrown for his only daughter. He imagined crystal chandeliers, a 10-piece orchestra, champagne flowing like water. Not this. Craft beer and sparkling cider affair. He glanced across the manicured lawn where Sarah stood talking to guests, a serene smile on her face. She looked good, annoyingly so. Happy. Content next to David, whose ill-fitting tan suit practically screamed community college professor, which, Richard recalled with a sneer, he actually was. The ceremony itself was lovely, Richard had to admit. Held under a sprawling oak tree draped in white chiffon, Emily looked ethereal. Her groom, Michael Chen, a quiet but clearly devoted young software engineer, looked suitably awestruck. Richard felt a lump form in his throat as he walked Emily down the aisle, her small hand tucked into his arm. For those few steps, the bitterness receded. This was his daughter, his blood, embarking on her own life. He handed her over to Michael, offered a stiff but heartfelt handshake, and took his seat in the front row, pointedly ignoring Sarah and David beside him. The reception began under a large, open-sided marquee. Laughter mingled with the clinking of glasses and the gentle strumming of an acoustic guitar duo. Richard nursed a scotch, keeping to himself initially, observing. He saw the easy camaraderie between Sarah, David, and their friends. He saw the way David placed a gentle hand on Sarah's back. He saw the modest buffet spread, pulled pork sliders, caprese skewers, a pasta station. Adequate, he supposed. Not exactly filet mignon and lobster tails. His resentment simmered, fueled by the scotch and a deep-seated insecurity he'd never admit to. The divorce hadn't just cost him his marriage. His subsequent business ventures hadn't quite recaptured the soaring success of his earlier years. He was comfortable. Yes, very comfortable. But not throw $1 million wedding comfortable anymore. Seeing Sarah apparently thriving, content in this simpler life, with this simpler man, grated on him. It felt like a judgment on him. As the evening wore on, the toasts began. The best man was charmingly awkward. The maid of honor, Emily's childhood friend, shared tearful, funny anecdotes. Then, Michael's father gave a warm, welcoming speech. Finally, it was the father of the bride's turn. Richard felt a shift in the atmosphere as he stood, microphone in hand. People expected sentimentality, perhaps a few embarrassing dad jokes. Richard intended to deliver something else entirely. He started smoothly enough. "Emily," he began, his voice resonating through the speakers. "My beautiful daughter, seeing you today, radiant, happy. It's every father's dream." He paused, letting the warmth hang in the air. Emily beamed at him, her eyes shining. Michael squeezed her hand. "I remember when you were just a little girl," Richard continued, his gaze sweeping across the guests before landing, deliberately, on Sarah. "We had such plans for you. Such dreams." He took a sip of his scotch, which a server had helpfully refilled. "Of course, life throws curveballs, doesn't it, Sarah?" Sarah's serene expression tightened almost imperceptibly. David shifted uncomfortably beside her. Richard chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "I always pictured your wedding day, Emily. A grand affair, the best of everything. Because you deserve the best." He gestured vaguely around the marquee. "And this is lovely. Very charming, rustic." He let the word hang there, loaded with condescension. "It takes a certain kind of man," he went on, his voice hardening slightly, "to provide the very best, to really pull out all the stops. Maybe something a little more fitting for a girl like Emily." His eyes flicked towards David, who sat frozen, his face slowly reddening. "Something substantial. Not," he paused for effect, swirling his drink, "cobbled together on a budget." A horrified gasp rippled through the guests. Several people exchanged shocked glances. Sarah looked like she'd been slapped. "I mean, don't get me wrong," Richard plowed on, oblivious, or perhaps reveling in the discomfort he was causing. "I'm sure David here did his absolute best. Commendable, really, given the circumstances." He gave David a pitying look. "It's just, well, Emily, darling, if your mother and I were still—" He didn't get to finish. Emily, who had been staring at him with dawning horror, suddenly let out a choked sob. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "Dad, stop! Please, just stop!" She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Michael immediately wrapped his arms around her, glaring daggers at Richard. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he hissed across the space. The music ground to a halt. A thick, awful silence descended, broken only by Emily's heartbroken sobs. Richard stood there, microphone still in hand, a defiant, almost bewildered look on his face, as if he couldn't understand what he'd done wrong. Sarah rose slowly, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a cold fire Richard hadn't seen in over a decade. She walked directly up to him, ignoring the horrified stares of the guests. "Give me the microphone, Richard," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. He hesitated, then relinquished it. Sarah turned to face the stunned crowd. "I apologize," she said, her voice clear and steady, though trembling slightly. "Deeply. For this interruption. This day is about Emily and Michael, and the love they share. Nothing else matters." She then looked directly at Richard, her voice dropping so only he could hear, though her eyes conveyed the message to everyone nearby. "You and I will talk later. You just made the biggest mistake of your life." She then turned back to Emily, helping her gently from her chair. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's fix your makeup." Supported by Michael and her mother, Emily allowed herself to be led away from the marquee, her weeping audible, even as they moved towards the main house. David followed, casting one look of profound disgust and hurt back at Richard before disappearing. Nutsate. Atmosphere was ruined. Guests murmured uncomfortably. Some started making excuses to leave. The band didn't know whether to start playing again. Richard stood alone, the remnants of his toxic speech hanging in the air like poison. He tried to catch the eye of some old acquaintances, but they avoided his gaze. He felt a prickle of unease beneath the lingering buzz of the scotch. Sarah's threat. It had sounded serious. The rest of the evening was a strained, awkward affair. Emily eventually returned, her eyes red and swollen, putting on a brave face but clearly shattered. She barely looked at her father. The cake was cut with forced smiles. The first dance felt painful to watch. Richard found himself isolated, a pariah at his own daughter's wedding. He left early, the cheerful facade of the venue now feeling mocking and hollow. 2 days later, Sarah called him. Her voice was devoid of emotion, flat and businesslike. "Richard, we need to meet. My lawyer's office, tomorrow at 10. "Lawyer? Sarah, what is this? About the wedding?" "I admit, maybe I had a bit too much scotch, said a few things." "Save it, Richard. She cut him off. This isn't about your drunken ramblings, though they certainly provided the motivation. This is about promises you made and conveniently forgot. 10 a.m. Don't be late. She hung up. Richard felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. What promises? The divorce settlement had been finalized years ago. He'd paid alimony. Child support had ended when Emily turned 18. What could she possibly want? The lawyer's office was sleek and modern, radiating expensive competence. Sarah was already there, seated opposite a stern-looking woman in a power suit, Linda Holloway-esque. Sarah looked composed, dressed impeccably, her face unreadable. "Richard, thank you for coming," Linda Holloway began, gesturing for him to sit. "Sarah has asked me to mediate a matter arising from your divorce agreement, specifically pertaining to funds set aside for Emily." Richard frowned. Everything was settled. The accounts were divided. "Not quite," Sarah said, speaking for the first time. "Do you remember Clause 7B, Richard? The supplemental agreement regarding Emily's future milestones, specifically the Significant Life Events Fund?" Richard vaguely recalled something like that. A loosely worded clause about contributing to major expenses, college graduation, maybe a down payment on a house, a wedding. It had been added late in the negotiations, more of a gentleman's agreement than a strictly enforced mandate, or so he'd thought. He hadn't paid much attention to it once the main assets were divided. He certainly hadn't put any specific money aside. Linda Holloway slid a document across the table. "This is a copy of the signed addendum, Richard. It stipulates a joint contribution, but acknowledges your significantly higher earning potential at the time, outlining an expectation for you to contribute a minimum of 75% towards a fund, capped at $100,000 for such events. The mechanism was left open, predicated on mutual agreement when an event arose." "We never mutually agreed on a mechanism," Richard protested. "It was vague." "Perhaps," Linda conceded smoothly, "but the intent was clear, and Sarah, quite generously, never pressed the issue for Emily's college graduation present, nor for a potential house down payment. She covered those additional expenses herself, or chose to forgo asking, wanting to maintain peace for Emily's sake." "So what?" Richard snapped, feeling cornered. "She can't just decide 10 years later to enforce some vague clause." "Actually," Sarah interjected, her voice still calm but laced with steel, "your behavior at the wedding changed things. You stood up in front of my daughter, my husband, our friends and family, and you belittled the beautiful wedding we provided for her. You publicly lamented your inability, due to me, you implied, to give her the grand affair she deserved. You specifically mocked David's financial ability to host it." She leaned forward slightly. "Well, Richard, here's your chance to put your money where your drunken mouth was. You wanted Emily to have a proper wedding fund? You felt David and I fell short? Fine, you can make it right." Linda Holloway slid another paper across. It was a simple calculation. The documented cost of the wedding, including venue, catering, attire, and all associated expenses, came to $42,700, she stated. "Sarah and David paid for this entirely. Given your public comments disparaging their contribution and expressing your desire to have provided something more, Sarah feels it's appropriate that you retroactively fulfill your obligation under Clause 7B by covering this cost." Richard stared at the number. $42,000. It wasn't insignificant, even for him. "This is outrageous. Blackmail." "It's fulfilling a promise you made, Richard," Sarah said coolly. "A promise you were happy to ignore until you decided to humiliate my husband and devastate our daughter publicly. You wanted to talk about money? Let's talk about money. And there's the matter of emotional distress," Linda Holloway added smoothly. "Your actions caused significant harm to Emily. On what should have been the happiest day of her life, she required consoling. The event was disrupted, and a pall was cast over the entire celebration. Sarah is also seeking damages for that. She named another figure, $20,000, $62,700. Richard sputtered, standing up abruptly. "You must be joking. I won't pay a cent." "Then we'll see you in court," Linda said without blinking. "We will file to enforce Clause 7B, citing your own public statements at the wedding as evidence of your acknowledgement of a perceived shortfall and your desire to have contributed more, substantially. We will subpoena guests to testify about your exact words regarding David's inability to afford the wedding you felt Emily deserved. We will detail the emotional distress caused to Emily. It will be messy, Richard. Public. Your business contacts might find the details interesting, especially the part where you tried to welsh on a commitment to your own daughter after publicly shaming her mother and stepfather." Richard sank back into his chair. He could see the headlines. He could imagine the whispers in his club, the knowing looks from business associates. Sarah wasn't bluffing. Her lawyer wasn't bluffing. He had grossly underestimated Sarah's resolve, fueled by his attack on her daughter and her husband. His arrogant, drunken speech had given her the perfect weapon. He looked at Sarah. Her expression was resolute. There was no pity there, only a cold determination. He had sown the wind, and now he was reaping the whirlwind. The irony was bitter. His attempt to flaunt his supposed superiority had resulted in him being forced to pay for the very wedding. He had mocked, plus damages. "Fine," he ground out, the word tasting like ash. "Fine. Draw up the papers. I'll have my bank wire the funds." "Wire transfer within 48 hours, Linda Holloway stipulated. "Into a trust account for Emily's benefit, managed by Sarah." Richard nodded curtly, unable to meet Sarah's gaze. He signed the agreement Linda quickly prepared, his hand shaking slightly with fury and humiliation. He left the lawyer's office, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. He had the money. Paying it wouldn't break him. But the cost was far greater than $62,000. It was the cost of his relationship with Emily, now fractured perhaps beyond repair. It was the cost of his pride, publicly and privately shattered. It was the price of his bitterness, a bill that had finally come due. Sarah, meanwhile, used the money exactly as promised. She set up a trust for Emily. Part of it went towards an upgraded honeymoon for Emily and Michael, a trip they hadn't thought they could afford. Another portion was earmarked for a future down payment on a house. A small amount covered a few therapy sessions for Emily to process the emotional fallout from the wedding day. The largest portion, representing the wedding costs, Sarah mentally allocated back to herself and David, though she never told David the specifics of the amount, only that Richard had been made to fulfill an old obligation. The money didn't erase the memory of Richard's cruel words or Emily's tears, but it was a tangible consequence, a form of justice. Sarah didn't gloat. She felt a grim satisfaction, mingled with a deep sadness that it had come to this. Richard had tried to assert his power through mockery and implied wealth, but she had used his own words, his own arrogance, and the quiet force of a forgotten promise to make him pay, ensuring that his cruelty didn't go unanswered, and that Emily, at least financially, wouldn't bear the cost of her father's bitterness. The real cost, the emotional toll on a father-daughter relationship, was something Richard Miller would be paying for a very long time.